The goal of life is rapture. Art is the way we experience it. Joseph Campbell. At the end of the previous episode, I promised a discussion about the art of philosophy. That was well over 6 months ago at this point, and in case you didn't notice, some stuff came up in the meantime. The world, it feels, has been turned upside down in the last few months. So I decided to take a minute to reassess the direction this season was going. And I waited. In the first season of Quite Useless, I devoted a whole episode to the phenomenon of waiting, what happens when we are forced to wait, when there are no paths available to us, what that does to us, and what it represents. I started off the episode talking about Joseph Campbell, a 20th century scholar of mythology. Campbell is most famous for his theory of the hero's journey, a concept that has become hugely influential in modern storytelling, especially in Hollywood. I examined stories where the call to adventure that normally signals the start of the hero's journey never comes, or is confusing or contradictory. And I looked at examples from theater, literature, mythology, scripture, and my own life. I got thinking about that episode again recently because of the holding pattern that millions of us have now been in for months. Like a lot of people out there, I've been doing a lot of waiting lately. Waiting for files to upload for the online classes I've been teaching. Waiting for packages to arrive in the mail. Waiting to hear what our local school district's latest plan for the fall semester is, and then waiting for them to change their tune days later. And now waiting for my son's assignments to upload for his online kindergarten class. Waiting to see if things are ever going to get better. Waiting to see how much worse things can get. Of course, some people haven't been waiting. Some people have been out there on the front lines working this whole time because they had to. Many people have been out on the street protesting and calling for change, but it seems like most folks I know, or see on Facebook at least, are suspended in one way or another. It feels like we're all being subjected to a massive psychological experiment in waiting, wishing there was something we could do, and realizing over and over, like Vladimir at the opening of Waiting for Godot, that there simply is nothing to be done. But I also have to come clean about something. You see, I played a little fast and loose with one aspect of the hero's journey when I described it in that episode last season. I implied that Joseph Campbell doesn't account for the cruel phenomenon of waiting, of forced inaction, for this feeling of helplessness at the cold tide of time. This is not the case. Campbell does account for what happens when the call goes unheard or unheeded, and a would-be hero is left in the lurch. This condition, he writes, is the wasteland, described by T.S. Eliot in his famous poem.
What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water.
The call does come to all of us, Campbell suggests. It's just that we are often too dense or distracted to notice. And when we miss the call, when we miss our calling, we are left to pick up the scraps, struggling to hold on to something, anything that might give our lives some semblance of order and meaning. But it's all junk, debris, detritus. Our lives become like that scene in the movie Labyrinth where the protagonist is tempted by a bunch of knockoff simulacrums of the things she used to treasure.
Don't you like your toys?
It's all junk.
Huh? Well, what about this? This is not junk. Eh?
Yes, it is!
Except that most of us aren't blessed with a charismatic villain like David Bowie's Goblin King breathing down our necks. We just have to stumble and slog through our lives trying to hold it all together. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot's poem, these are the fragments we shore against our ruin. But it's a vain effort. As a character howls in a moment of desperation in Henrik Ibsen's Dollhouse, after this there is no happiness, only holding the wreckage together, the scraps and shards. I've been doing a medium-depth dive into Joseph Campbell's work, including a number of interviews he gave in the 1980s near the end of his life. In one interview with Bill Moyers, part of a series packaged as The Power of Myth, Campbell says that the world is a wasteland. On its own terms, it holds nothing for us. It is indifferent to our needs, desires, and expectations. Life may be nasty, brutish, and short, or it may be artificially protracted, extended, robbed of its vitality. It is only through the restructuring of the mental and spiritual models we use to frame our lives that we can live in a way that is authentic, engaged, and rewarding. And for Campbell, myths provide the templates and patterns for how this may be done. The peculiar problem for modern human beings, according to Campbell, is that we don't think mythically anymore. Modern society has become too rational and systematized, too political and efficient, too mechanized and programmatic. Everything pertaining to value is phrased in economic terms. We no longer have the kinds of stories that are aimed to provide us with the equipment for passing from one phase of life to another, that help us mature, and that invest our brief interval on this earth with depth and wonder. And when the carrots and prods that are meant to guide us in modern society suddenly elude us, we end up with the ailment I examined back in the first season. We find ourselves in the condition of waiting, as we are now, filling our time with idle activities, dully hoping that somehow, someday, some kind of meaning will emerge, some sense will arise from the chaotic picture before us. Or else we rage internally or externally against the dullness and futility of our lives. In short, we end up gripped by depression or anxiety. Often both. This is what we're living with now. It has become clear that the pandemic didn't so much create a lot of new problems as expose the massive fault lines in the way our societies and our lives are structured. It laid bare the wasteland that we're all living in. This is where myth is meant to step in and guide us. Myth helps us to organize our lives against the insistent and deadening pressure of the wasteland. Sadly, ceding to this pressure has become the ordinary condition for modern human beings. We take this condition for granted, attempting to inoculate or medicate ourselves with drugs, diversions, therapy, and lately with social media. This is what Thoreau meant when he wrote that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. It is the despair that Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. That's why we need the deep wells of wisdom, both grounding and transcendent, embedded in mythology. We can't do this on our own. We need stories that will give shape to our movement through the world. But again, Campbell tells us that in modern Western civilization, we no longer have any myths to guide us. So what are we supposed to do? Well, Campbell has another prescription expressed in his famous dictum, "Follow your bliss." Obey the imperatives of your own mind and body rather than the dictates of tradition, society, authority, or economy. But I gotta say, while I appreciate the sentiment, follow your bliss rings a little hollow at this moment in our history. Even for those of us whose health or finances haven't been decimated by the pandemic and who aren't suffering the continued legacy of systemic oppression, for those of us who have little more to complain about than having to spend a lot more time working online than we would like to, and having very little time in the day when we can tune in or, say, create an episode of a podcast because the little ones are constantly barking demands and complaints at us, even for those of us who are doing comparatively well right now, the prospect of following our bliss still feels frustratingly out of reach. We might see this as another way that the COVID epidemic has exposed a number of weaknesses that already afflicted us. Now, I'm not talking about disaster preparedness, investment in health and social services, and systemic inequality. These are all major social issues that we need to address. But right now I'm talking about something different. What I'm referring to is a spiritual problem in modern society, American society in particular. One that renders us unfit to confront the little crises that punctuate or permeate our lives under ordinary circumstances, much less in the midst of a cataclysm like this one. You see, there's one thing that I think Joseph Campbell got wrong. Our problem is not that we don't have any myths to guide us. Our problem is that we're relying on the wrong myths. I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode I take a look at a different topic in the arts, exploring how art both reflects and shapes our view of the world. For this episode, I'm taking a break from my sequence inspired by Plato's allegory of the cave to look at the role of myth in American society. In a series of interviews conducted by Bill Moyers in the 1980s, Joseph Campbell proposed that modern society has become so mechanized and economical that we have lost the organic sources of myth that had so long sustained humankind. But he also says that we can't look to the myths of old to provide that sustenance for us now. We'll never have the intimate, organic comprehension and connection with them that was enjoyed by the members of the cultures where those myths originated. When Moyers presses Campbell on where we might look for new myths that would suit our present situation and needs, however, Campbell grows a bit cagey. In one interview, Moyers specifically wonders whether a popular medium like film might do the job. He invokes the then-recent Star Wars trilogy. At this suggestion, Campbell becomes animated. He notes that George Lucas did the cycle of the hero's journey perfectly, and anyone who's read The Hero with a Thousand Faces and seen the movies knows this is true. It's all there, from Luke's call to adventure and initial refusal of the call, to his mystical mentorship at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the little man in the woods in the form of Yoda, the tyrant Emperor Palpatine, all the way through to Luke's atonement with the Father at the conclusion of the original trilogy. Campbell describes the scene in the trash compactor aboard the Death Star as an example of the belly of the beast motif, in which the hero is faced with absorption and annihilation by subterranean forces representing the subconscious. Now, it's not surprising that Campbell would have such flattering things to say about the Star Wars trilogy. He and Moyers were recording the interviews at Skywalker Ranch, the home of George Lucas's production studio. Lucas had read The Hero with a Thousand Faces while writing Star Wars and credits it with inspiring the series' mythic depth and structure. He later approached and befriended Campbell after the trilogy's release. Campbell, who in an earlier interview said he hadn't seen a Hollywood film in decades, provided an amicable audience for Lucas's films. I'm not so cynical as to suggest that Campbell was pandering or engaging in an unspoken quid pro quo or even humoring his friend in describing how effective the mythology of Star Wars is. I suspect Campbell's admiration for the narrative genius of the work was genuine. But I can't help sensing a certain restraint when I listen to Campbell talking about it. It's as though he regards the commercial art of Star Wars as a mechanical expression of the mythic qualities it tries to manifest. That is, the series is an expression of the ills of the era in which it was made, as much as an embodiment of the timeless dimensions of myth. Campbell uses the word programmatic repeatedly in disparaging works of popular art and fiction, distinguishing works that are designed to produce a predictable effect from those that emanate organically and largely unconsciously from the psyche of the artist. It's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have seen Star Wars as programmatic, as an impeccably designed narrative machine rendered from the template of the hero's journey. At any rate, while he obviously has some regard for the craft that went into Star Wars, it doesn't sound as if Campbell thinks this or any other mainstream movie is likely to be the strong medicine we need. Elsewhere in his interviews with Moyers, Campbell speaks spiritedly of the role of other kinds of artists in the contemporary world, comparing wild-eyed poets and painters operating at the fringes of society with the mystical shamans and soothsayers of older civilizations. I discussed this concept in reference to Antonin Artaud in the previous episode Mad Men. But while I agree with Campbell that artistic geniuses may tap into profound and transcendent territory in their irrational reveries, I'm skeptical of their potential to shake the foundations of the modern world. Take a straw poll of people you know, asking how many have heard of Antonin Artaud, and you'll probably get the sense that his work is unlikely to be a source of spiritual elevation for any but a select few. Nothing on the order of the broad societal renewal Artaud himself envisioned. Pulsing, unstable minds like his are just too marginalized today. They are not afforded the simultaneous fear and reverence they were in traditional societies. So where does that leave us? Popular entertainment, even though much of it is inspired by the forms of myth, is a hollow shadow of those forms. But the kind of organic work of genius that might shake the soul tends to stay at the margins, or else it is domesticated as it's processed through the academics and critics who, in our society, act as the arbiters of good taste. Where are we to find stories that will bring about penetrating conversions of mind, heart, and spirit today? Where are we to find our myths to live by? Campbell didn't have a clear answer for this. But I have a thought about what kinds of myths we may need, or at least what's been lacking in those that have arisen in recent decades. And here we turn once again to long ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Now, I have as many problems with the new Star Wars films as the next movie fan. The Force Awakens was nauseatingly derivative. The Last Jedi felt like an unfaithful departure from the spirit of the series while also being aesthetically out of step. And The Rise of Skywalker, while enjoyable, was a narrative stew of retcons, loose ends, and poorly set up plot twists. But there was something that happened in the middle of the trilogy that had a whiff of excitement surrounding it, and maybe, just maybe, the prospect of mining some serious thematic territory. When it was announced that Rian Johnson would be writing and directing the second installment of the series, a lot of people, including myself, took note. Known for dark twists on established genres like his high school noir debut Brick and the insidiously disturbing time travel thriller Looper, Johnson seemed like the kind of filmmaker who might wrench the series out of the kid-friendly Disneyland fare of the prequels and restore it to its former glory. Or perhaps take it into uncharted and conceptually exhilarating territory. He kind of delivered if the main thing we were looking for was a take that didn't observe a kind of narrative stare decisis, just deferring to what had been done before. Johnson didn't seem to give a shit what George Lucas or J.J. Abrams or anyone else involved in the series before him had done. He derailed the apparent trajectory for the trilogy's protagonist that had been set up in the previous film. But he also did something that is, in my view, even more subversive. Spoilers immediately ahead, though honestly nothing I'm about to say hasn't been said by other commentators before me. By positing that Rey's parentage was unimportant, and even more so by introducing the possibility that Force-gifted children might be scattered about the galaxy in low places, Johnson rejected an essential element of the Star Wars mythos. I'm talking about a kind of hereditary individualism, whereby the work of heroic individuals is paramount in shaping the course of galactic affairs, but principally the efforts of a small set of individuals with surnames like Skywalker and Kenobi, and in Episode 9, Palpatine. Now, I know, this is ridiculous. It sounds like I'm at the brink of proposing that Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, in many people's view, one of the worst, perhaps the worst, entry in the whole cycle, is the hiding place wherein lies the pearl of great price, the boon that will bring the long-lost virtues of myth back to modern civilization. This is not what I'm saying. Not quite. Heck, I didn't even especially like The Last Jedi. It's riddled with flaws, including a lot of hero's journey cliches. For example, Rey's descent into the underground mirror cave has to be one of the most ham-handed expressions of the shadow doppelganger archetype ever committed to film. But there is something in what Rian Johnson was attempting that strikes me as, at the very least, admirable. Although it is set in a galaxy far, far away, Star Wars has always been emblematic of that most American of myths, the myth of rugged individualism. But again, it's a rugged individualism inflected with the notion that only the actions of the well-born really matter, the deeds of a handful of roguish secondary heroes like Han Solo notwithstanding. Now, this isn't exactly a new or American trope. The legend of the Buddha, for instance, is very concerned with the holy figure's lineage of both earthly and karmic/reincarnatory varieties. And the folklore cataloged by Joseph Campbell from cultures all over the world abounds with tales of characters whose parentage, like Luke Skywalker's, comes to climactic light as a key element of the story. We see variations on this theme in the stories of Moses and Oedipus. But there seems to be something about this trope that has attached itself to the American zeitgeist like stars on stripes. We love to celebrate the actions and accomplishments of extraordinary individuals, but we love it even more if they're part of a dynasty. We seem to be at a moment in human history where perpetuating the notion that our salvation will lie in the endeavors of a handful of heroic individuals isn't really serving us. Much of the rest of the world has already abandoned this absurdity. But we in the US cannot seem to ditch it, even if it's threatening our lives. A recent study by 4 professors at the University of Virginia and the University of British Columbia investigated the relationship between cultures of individualism and the spread of coronavirus in the United States. The researchers examined centuries-old data about how much time various counties had spent on the American frontier. This is a common surrogate used in the social sciences to assess cultural legacies of individualism. They then weighed these figures against information about compliance with social distancing mandates and crowdfunding for COVID-19 treatments. Their calculations confirmed something that I, for one, had suspected since early on in the pandemic. There is a strong correlation between ingrained cultures of individualism and increased spread of the virus. Places that spent a lot of time on the frontier and where frontier values like self-reliance are deeply embedded in the cultural fabric have worse compliance with preventive measures and higher rates of infection. American individualism is literally killing us. Which brings us back to Star Wars. This is a series that literally portrays the bad guys as mask-wearing tools of the government. No, I'm not using that as an actual argument. That was a joke. But even so, the whole series vigorously and mindlessly peddles traditional American values, specifically the myth of rugged individualism, a myth sewn into the fabric of American philosophy and storytelling. What Rian Johnson attempted, and what made The Last Jedi feel so off-kilter in the trajectory of the series, was to introduce an egalitarian and collectivist strain to the narrative. All the people are in it together, and no, not everyone can be a Jedi, but the genetic predisposition to that particular gift is randomly distributed throughout the peoples of the galaxy. It isn't the exclusive domain of a few superior families. Even Luke's climactic duel with Kylo Ren displays fewer individualist tendencies than his battles in the earlier episodes. Rather than triumphantly delivering the fatal blow, as in A New Hope, or bravely confronting his father archetype, as in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Luke engages in a diversion. While it comes at enormous personal cost, it is directly staged as a sacrifice to the larger collective effort. It is not about his personal triumph. The critical moment comes in the middle of the duel.
I'll destroy her, and you, and all of it.
No. Strike me down in anger, and I'll always be with you. Just like your father.
This bit of dialogue suggests to me that Johnson had done his research. In one of his interviews with Bill Moyers, Campbell tells the story of a samurai who goes to exact justice for the murder of his uncle by slaying the man's killer. But when he faces the murderer, the man taunts the samurai. In response, the samurai sheathes his sword and withdraws. The killer had provoked him emotionally, and he knew that if he killed him at that moment, he would be doing so out of anger, in pursuit of vengeance, rather than justice. Unlike a samurai blade, myths have two edges. They can reveal deep, hidden truths about our place in the world, but they can also distort the truth and make us believe in all manner of enduring and pernicious lies. The myth of American individualism doesn't merely tell us that people are free to do as they wish and ought to be left to fend for themselves. It promotes a value system in which the only things that are worth pursuing are those that are gained through solo effort and achievement. Individual attainment is paramount. But it only counts, or it's only possible, if you're a member of a pre-selected group of elites. This myth ignores the complex matrix of interdependencies within which individuals act. The myth of American individualism, propagated by stories told since before the dawn of this nation, refuses to acknowledge the fact that all of our actions have collective underpinnings and collective implications. In the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, who knew a little something about myths, draws a distinction between allegory and applicability. People had begun to read his work as an allegory of the grand confrontation of the Second World War, with Sauron representing Hitler and the hobbits the good, humble, earthy folk of England. Tolkien states flatly that this view of the books is wrong. He writes, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author. The one resides in the freedom of the reader, applicability, and the other in the purposed domination of the author, allegory." This distinction presents us with a twofold difficulty and danger today. The first is that we have an affinity for allegory. Some folks, of course, believe in their chosen or inherited myths as literal historical accounts of things that went before, to the necessary exclusion of the truth of other people's myths. But even those of us who don't fall prey to this kind of obvious misconception may yet have a tendency to read stories as allegories, with one precise and definitive meaning that works to the exclusion of other readings. Here we might say that Tolkien doesn't take his critique of allegory far enough. Allegory may reside in the purposed domination of the author, but it may just as well reside in the purposed domination of an insistent reader. Myth is meant to open worlds to us, and myths appeal to us because of their ranging applicability. Some enduring myths, like those in the scripture of our world religions, prove their applicability to generation after generation, retaining their power even as whole civilizations crumble and others rise. Myths expand our view of things. Allegory does the opposite. It forecloses ranges of meaning and interpretation in favor of mandated views. Allegory, when we get down to it, is a form of propaganda. The other trouble with applicability in American society today is that many of our older, homegrown myths, the ones we have so long relied on, no longer seem to apply. Again, Joseph Campbell is right that we need new myths, but it's not because we don't have our own. It's because we're working with the wrong myths. Many of us understand now the trouble with the old Western legends, for instance. We understand that their overarching motif, which historian Richard Slotkin describes as regeneration through violence, represents the worst imperialist white supremacist tendencies in our nation's history. The revolutionary lore from and about the early days of our plucky upstart nation are little better in this regard. For that matter, how is a film like Gone with the Wind or even Forrest Gump supposed to inform or frame our path in the world or our view of our history and culture? We are in the midst of a massive cultural awakening, and a big part of it is realizing how the stories we've been telling and hearing and reading and watching for decades and decades grew out of polluted soil. The soil of patriarchy, white supremacy, the ethnocentric and xenophobic belief in the superiority of Western civilization, and the fallacious ideology of individualism. Stories growing out of this ground cannot guide us into the next phase of our history. Our American myths are broken, and we need new ones. What kind of stories do we need? It's not a question that I think any one person would be in a position to answer. I certainly am not. It remains to be seen what kind of tales will emerge to help enrich and shape our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world, to help us rise out of the wasteland of living in a plague state, with even larger cataclysms like massive ecological collapse on the horizon. Because that is, of course, how myths are supposed to work. They're supposed to grow organically out of a society, just as Joseph Campbell liked to say, human beings don't come into the world, we come out of it. Myths are supposed to take on the forms proper to the culture in which they emerge, to be dressed in the local colors, even as they speak to deep and perennial truths. But I also think there's another way in which our relation to myth has dried up or turned sour in the modern world. And here, I do have some thoughts on how we might address this deficiency. Joseph Campbell distinguishes between different modalities of myth. The first is a kind of adventure tale, legends of slaying dragons and conquering tyrants. This type of myth is marked by physical accomplishments, restoring and transforming the external world, bringing society into order. Most of our modern adventure epics like Star Wars and the Marvel Cinematic Universe fit into this category. The second modality is the religious or spiritual myth, like those found in Scripture. Christ and the Buddha and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita undergo internal transformation, often after periods of extended introspection and the refusal of temptations. These are myths that depict the reclamation of spirit and reunification not only with the local community, but with all being. These make explicit the interior meaning of all myth. Even Arthurian legends and tales of the Greek titans and heroes and gods and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the tales of the 1001 Nights covertly represent the subtler, more profound correspondences between human existence and the ground of our being. Of course, many people miss or mar the significance of these religious myths entirely. They invert the direction in which the meaning points by transforming a tale of spiritual transcendence into a triumphalist narrative about vanquishing one's foes. At the extreme end of this conceptual degeneration lies a gun-wielding Jesus riding a velociraptor, presumably on the hunt for abortion providers and climate scientists. But there's a third modality of myth as well, and it's the one that traditionally was most intimately woven into the fabric of human life. These are myths that are bound up with communal rites and rituals. In traditional societies, these ceremonies simultaneously bind the community in a shared spiritual orientation and aid the individual in their maturation, signaling a shift from one station of life to another. Campbell writes in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the so-called rites of passage, ceremonials of birth, naming, puberty, marriage, burial, etc., are distinguished by formal and usually very severe exercises of severance, whereby the mind is radically cut away from the attitudes, attachments, and life patterns of the stage being left behind. Then follows an interval of more or less extended retirement, during which are enacted rituals designed to introduce the life adventurer to the forms and proper feelings of his new estate, so that when, at last, the time has ripened for the return to the normal world, the initiate will be as good as reborn. We have analogous rituals today, and they come in both secular and religious flavors. First day of school, graduation, baptism, first communion, confirmation, bar and bat mitzvahs, first date, homecoming, the prom, weddings, baby showers, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the 4th of July, Bastille Day. These traditions do have value in our lives and in society. They form critical touchstones in our annual calendar and in the arc of our lives. There is a rationale, for instance, to getting married before a gathering of friends and family rather than eloping. and it has little to do with forming a conga line after the 8th round of beer and wine, something that actually happened at my wedding. Whether religious or secular, the marriage ceremony converts an agreement between two individuals into a social covenant, a dimension that gives it added power both for those entering into the contract and for those bearing witness. By and large, however, our contemporary rites and rituals have become flattened, attenuated, domesticated. They lack the shocking immediacy and vigor of the old ways. They don't have the same power to induce a deep psychological transformation. Frankly, they lack the drama to do so, the immersive artistry that seizes the minds and bodies of the participants and calls upon the person at the center of the ritual to step out of their old skin and to become a new person. Artists sometimes reflect this loss by describing scenes where ancient rites, or simulations of those rites, are brought jarringly into the present day. Movies like Eyes Wide Shut, Suspiria, and even Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom come to mind. Other artists create work that attempts to recreate these experiences in theaters, studios, concerts, or dance clubs. I dabbled a bit in this mode in my 20s. If I might brag a little bit, one theater reviewer in Chicago wrote of a semi-immersive piece I directed, a production of the play Mercury by Philip Ridley, that Sophocles himself couldn't have asked for a more viable catharsis. And in the previous episode, of course, I described a pair of theater artists, Antonin Artaud and Jerzy Grotowski, who devoted their careers to bringing the long-lost primal potency of performance to the contemporary stage. But in my experience, these efforts to capture something of the spirit of ancient rituals feel strained and inauthentic. We may have inherited the bodies and brains of our ancestors, as your local paleo buff can tell you about, but we have not inherited their lifestyles, cultural heritage, and the social contexts in which these practices arose and which imbued them with their proper force and authority. Unlike the frightened teenagers undergoing traditional rites of passage, we know that we can always leave the theater. We don't have to partake of the performance. We know, in short, that we are individuals, self-determining, able and expected to choose what we value and what we are willing to subject ourselves to. For better or worse, individualism has become our default psychological mode. It is our way of life, even for those of us who adopt more collectivist political stances. The horse has left the stable, and its old reins can no longer be expected to restrain it. We must look forward. We must work with and through our individuation and atomization, even as we strive to connect with wider and more varied communities locally, nationally, and globally. One phenomenon or practice that I'm attracted to in this regard is what Thomas More called the re-enchantment of everyday life. The thought is that our daily activities have become deadened, divested of any sense of engagement, wonder, and magic, but that with the right orientation, we can discover those ineffable qualities in the smallest and plainest of things. The way we button our shirt or cook a meal, or the sight of a hummingbird outside the window. It might sound trite or dripping with new-agey goo, but Moore was responding to something dire he perceived in the world around him. He was working from the premise that our spiritual well-being, and also our physical survival, is at stake. The ills of the contemporary world, from environmental devastation to economic and political oppression, stem from our increased alienation from the earth and our activities on it. The solution to our problems, along with broad social action, will have to involve reinvestment at the individual level. Each of us must realize that we didn't come into the world. We came out of it. A potential hazard of reading about the hero's journey is that we may feel that it doesn't apply to us, that we aren't called upon to venture out and slay dragons and save the world. And this may induce the kind of anxiety I described last season. We may feel that our lives lack meaning and purpose, that we aren't really living if we aren't in a place to embark on grand quests and vanquish evil foes. This is a mistake. Most of us do lead more modest lives, and the hero of myth is merely an emblem of the smaller personal quests that we all take. The essential triumph is an inward one. It's a triumph of mind, heart, and spirit. Most of us will lead quiet lives out of the spotlight. And sadly, they may be lives of quiet desperation, but with a different orientation, with an eye to the subtle art of living. They may just as well be lives of quiet enchantment. Viewed with new eyes, the wasteland may prove to be our promised land. This episode of Quite Useless was written, produced, performed, mixed, mastered, and edited by me, Greg Beam. I also made the music. You can find every episode of Quite Useless on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Please drop a rating or review if you have a second. It would really help me out. You can also find all the episodes on the website, thisisquiteuseless.com. For the rest of this season, I'll be returning to and concluding my foray into the territory inspired by Plato's allegory of the cave. And I promise I won't wait 9 months to do it this time, so check that out. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more mythic, enchanted, and always quite useless adventures.